Hey, friends, and welcome back to the show. I'm Kristi Lowe. I'm your host, and I am always glad whenever you and I get to spend some time together. We're talking today, we're going to continue this series called Naked and Unafraid, living a life that is expansive and big and full. And, I think of it as life to the fullest. What does life to the fullest mean? And, the first week we talked about vulnerability. The second week we talked about abandoning smallness and just letting God have access to that heart condition of anything that is petty or that is distracting in our lives. And then today we are attacking the subject. Is it attacking? That seems a little aggressive. The subject of owning our story. And I come to you pretty tenderly with this one, simply because this is so personal to me. But our story is a collection. A lot of people think, what's your story? And, if you had to just say one thing to define who you were, that would be unfair. And in so many ways, so limiting. If I just had to say, this was the one, this is it. There are those of us whose lives have been shaped by just one moment that just forever changed everything. But for many of us, it's a collection. It's beliefs, it's moments, it's failures and triumphs. It's that spectrum of everything from the boring and the mundane to the mind-bendingly beautiful moments too. And that's kind of what encompasses who you really and truly are. I think of it in terms of your story being everything that has happened to you and everything that has happened sometimes because of you. It's the unique experiences. It's the components of your life that really make you who you are. And today I want us to talk about what it really means to own your story, to take ownership and acceptance of who you are. And we hear that a lot. That's become a counselor's, kind of thing of, you've got to own your story. Well, what does that mean? And why? Some of you guys are like, I'm very content to leave my story in the past. That's where it belongs. And for some of you, it's about actually just acknowledging what your story is. Owning your story means having the self-awareness to acknowledge what encompasses your story. And trust me, that let me say this, that might sound simple, but it isn't always that easy. I know from experience that there are times in our life where we have things that we need to deal with, and for one reason or another, we just push them aside or we ignore them. See reference to those of you who want to leave your story in the past. But I want to encourage you right now that whatever work you put into today in this conversation, whatever you allow God to have access to while we are working through all of these things, when you give God access to your story, you're going to see more change come from you and that work, because it's work. I'm just going to be real with you. As my daughter says, I'm going to be so for real with you right now. It is work to own your past. About 8 years ago now, my world I had a seismic shift in my world. I had come to the realization a number of years before that my mom was mentally ill. And I knew that. I could not see initially also that in that mental illness, she was also psychologically and emotionally abusive at times. And so when I tell you that owning your story is not always easy, and it doesn't always just come very clearly, I say that with experience to tell you that you're not alone. It's hard sometimes to see the reality of what you're actually dealing with. And part of it, somebody, I think it was a therapist one time, told me that it's difficult at times to look at your reality for too long. Sometimes people can look at it, but there's only there's a finite amount of time that we can actually look at it without just looking away. Okay. And I don't know if you've ever been in that position, but what would happen in my world, and I hope that this is helpful to you, is reality for me took some time for me to actually sort through and get to a place where I could actually see the whole picture. It came to me in digestible chunks. Sometimes it would be weeks or months before I would realize something else about my reality. And I think that's just a gracious gift from God, for him to just say, okay, here's what you can see. All right, let's process that. Okay, here's what you can see. Now let's process that. But in 2016 is when I have said before, my world pretty much fell apart. Okay. I had come to the realization of several things surrounding my relationship with my mom. I had also come to the realization of some things my mom was doing that I couldn't turn a blind eye to any longer. And our relationship was broken at that point, and I had chosen to be estranged from her. And that is not a fun thing. Just for the record, nobody wakes up and says, hey, I think I want to be estranged from my parents. That sounds like a great idea. Nobody says that. Nobody. And part of the reason why I was so unhealthy in 2016 and in that season of life is because when I realized the enormity of what I was dealing with, there was nothing in me that said, ooh, I want to deal with this. Yes. In that moment, I began to run. And when I say run, I don't mean in the physical sense. I began to use every coping mechanism you can possibly imagine to deal with the pain and cover up the hurt and the wounds and try to avoid thinking about what I was dealing with. Okay? And so when I tell you, whenever we are getting healthy and we want to be naked and unafraid, owning our story is incredibly important. Incredibly important. Because what we do when we don't own our story, whew, y'all. I am testimony number one of how off the rails things will go when we don't, when we avoid it. I could have avoided so much pain and suffering if I had not run away and if I had just gone straight to the Lord in these times. And here's the thing. I was going to church on Sunday mornings. I was praising Jesus with my mouth. And yet I was so broken on the inside and much a shell and so depressed and grieving and hurting and wounded on the inside. And it took me coming to the realization that I was the train wreck. For me to begin the process of healing everything that had happened. So when I say to you that this is personal to me, I really mean it. I've been there. I really do understand how hard it is. Nobody wants to think about the heart. Nobody wants to think about the hard things or the painful things. Nobody wants to think about the trauma. No, you don't really want to think about the bad stuff in your life. And in a lot of ways, you might think that it's easier to not. It's easier if we don't, which is understandable. But when we do this, whenever we do this in our lives, whenever we run from our past or we run from our pain, we keep God at a distance. And you may be like, well, I'm still going to church. I'm still doing these things. But whenever we are pushing away parts of our story, or we are leaving them unresolved or unhealed or undealt with, there's going to be an inverse or there's going to be a problem with whatever it is that you're doing. Anything we do that pushes down pain holds God at a distance, because we're saying, I'm not going to deal with this and I'm not going to let you deal with it either. And that is where we find ourselves today. What do we do? What do we do with that? For some of us, it's just time to get real with ourselves. Okay. I find that writing is my way of coming to grips with things. I've always been a writer. I love writing. It's where I process. Some of us, it's going to be getting a counselor. For some of us, it's just going to be privately with you and God saying, I recognize this happened to me. That might be the most powerful thing you can do. I have a friend who very reluctantly one time shared with me that she had been sexually abused as a child, and she could barely even get the words out. And I saw the depth of pain she was in that place, and my heart honestly just broke, because not only had she endured it, but she was still carrying an immense amount of shame because of it. And in a moment where you come to the place of knowing that you have something that you are pushing down, it's time to get real with not only yourself, but with God too. Because healing cannot come. You're not going to live your most freest life until you own your story. And that includes all parts of it. That's all of the parts of your story. Not just the happy parts, not just the sad parts. I don't want you to end up just being some critical Debbie Downer that only focuses on the bad. But you've got to sit through the discomfort of your failures or your trauma or the awkwardness of what happened. And I will fully admit that this is a real super fun thing to do, right? But you can't heal what you don't acknowledge. Do you know that? You cannot heal what you do not recognize. You know, it's really hard. And when I said it a few minutes ago, that doing this is hard work, I recognize that it is hard work. I have been there and done that. I promise you, I get it. Some of us are so afraid, though, of thinking about any failures or trauma that, like, it petrifies us, like, to quote unquote go there. And so we push it down, or we run, or we ignore it. But pushing and running and ignoring it does not heal it. I promise you, this comes from experience. Y'all, whenever I was in my deepest, darkest places, I was drinking every day. I was numbing myself with anything I could do to numb myself. I would. My primary choice was alcohol. I would obsess over TV shows or things like that. But I was doing anything I could to numb myself. But healing the broken parts of our story comes when we stop running or we stop numbing. The good news is, there is good news in this. I'm not just hey, you need to own your crap. There is good news in this today. The good news is that when you just acknowledge what really happened, you get clarity. And not just what happened, but you also get clarity in the present. And I want to explain this. When you own your story, when you realize the entity or the entirety of what really happened, you not only understand and have clarity in the past, but you also get clarity in the present. Did I say president? You also get clarity in the present, because you begin to understand and you begin to see why you do the things you do, or you begin to understand why you're reacting to something that really is an overreaction. You begin to have more awareness of what has happened to you and now why you are responding to things the way you do. It's crazy, crazy blessing. A friend of mine grew up with a terribly critical parent. And no matter what my friend did, and I'm talking it was always like a biting there was always a biting response back. And I witnessed it so many times. And what happened to that friend is they ended up being paralyzed by the pressure of being perfect and perfection. And there was this internal voice of shame and condemnation that berated them every single time they made even the smallest, tiniest mistake. And at some point, what's funny is I realized it years ago. Like, I've known this person for a long time. And I realized years ago that there was that critical voice in their head, and they had not even put together that was tied to their earliest childhood memories, and that they had been made to feel less than or worthless. What I realized is that sometimes it's hard to see your story, even if you were the one who lived it. And that's why we need good friends that'll speak truth into our lives. That's why we need trusted family members, and we need therapists. We need people who can shine a light on the corners of our lives. The thing I've realized too is that as badly as we need to see ourselves and our story as it really is, we desperately need a proper view of Jesus. He is truly the key to our story, because without him and a proper view of him, we're hopeless, y'all, because he's the one who redeems all of it, right? And he loves us regardless of our past. He's the one who's already forgiven us for everything, for the things we wish we had never done. And can you believe it? He sees us as royalty. He sees us as God's children. And that is often hard for me to even wrap my mind around, but that he loves us entirely, and he forgives us entirely, and he knows everything that happened to you. He knows everything that happened because of you. He knows everything that happened, all of our failures, all of our flaws. He sees every bit of it. I love J. Kim's quote. He said that God asks for faithfulness, not flawlessness, which is so refreshing to me, because even if you've messed up, which, hey, join the club, Jesus is there to redeem it. He doesn't ask for flawlessness. He doesn't ask for our perfection. He asks for faithfulness, and I love that. When I was growing up, I always heard our pastor refer to Jesus as the great physician. And because I wasn't sick, I guess I thought he was only good for healing us like when we got sick, or whenever we got stomach bugs, or when we got the flu. And he does do those things. But what I see now is that our heart condition, the deepest, most painful parts of us, those broken places, he heals those too. And I get that I get that now more than ever. More than ever. I think the fear, and I mentioned this briefly at the beginning, I think the fear is sometimes, what is God going to do with it if I bring it up, if I deal with it? Am I going to have to be the spokesperson for, this sort of trauma? Or am I going to have to be the spokesperson for, children of divorces? Or am I going to have to be the spokesperson for sexual abuse? Or, whatever it is you dealt with and is part of your story. There's that fear that if I talk about this, am I going to have to become the spokesperson for it? And the long and short answer of that is no, probably not. Maybe, but no, probably not. And the reason why I say that is because, and this is where I want us to end today, whatever we're afraid of is likely just a lie that we are believing of the enemy. Whatever we're like, oh, I can't talk about this. I don't want to have to, lead a small group on this. I don't want to have to do this. How about this? Slow down. Don't get ahead of yourself here. The Lord does not want to heal you just to use you. Do you realize that? He's not going to use you. And I mean that in a take advantage of you way. You need to own your story, but that does not mean that you owe anyone else. Unless somebody has earned the right to know your story and know the details of your story, it is not a requirement that you share it. Today, what I'm talking about owning your story, what I mean by that is owning your story between you and God and letting Him have access to it, opening the door and saying, God, I realize what has happened. I realize this is part of what happened to me. This is my past. These are the decisions I made. This is what I did to somebody else. This is what happened to me. This is the way I was raised, Lord. But owning it does not mean that you owe somebody else. I don't know who needs to hear that today, but for me, that was so freeing, because there are parts of our stories that we don't have to share with the world. We just don't need to withhold them from Him. He's good. He is gracious. And He loves you. Oh, He loves you so much. He doesn't want you to hurt. He doesn't want you to hide. He's okay with you being naked and unafraid right with Him, because He's safe. He was there and He saw it all anyways. He grieves at the brokenness of this world. And He's not going to take advantage of you. He's not going to require something of you that you are not equipped to handle. Yeah, He's just not. That's just a good parent, a good father loves his children, and He just wants them to be healthy and healed and whole. What you do with that from that point forward is between the two of you, and you do not owe anybody else. Let's pray. Father, thank You that You are part of our story. Thank You that we can look through You at everything that has happened to us. Father, our stories are so scary sometimes. It's scary, Lord, to look back on them. It's scary to deal with the things that were hard to live through, that we don't want to live through it again. Lord, give us courage to look at the things of our life and the things that encompass us. Help us to see them the way that You see them, and not just through our eyes, Lord, but give us spiritual eyes to see our story. Give us the strength to look at it and to walk through it, Father, and to sit with You in the healing. Because we know that owning our story brings so much peace and helps us, Father, to be able to move forward into what You have called us and to do next. And Lord, it will free us from hanging on to baggage that You never intended for us to hold. Father, we give those places over to You today. And Father, I'm asking for just a nourishment and a refreshment in each person who hears these words, Lord. Let them be reminded that You alone are worthy of our trust and are the only one who can heal us, Father, from the inside out. It is in Your name, Jesus, I ask these things and I pray. Amen. Next week, we're talking about criticism, and that's definitely a conversation that I think is going to be pertinent to many of us. So stay tuned for that. All right, friends, thanks for being here, and good Lord willing, I will see you again next week. Bye.